This lecture will cover the material in section 3.1 of the text, which is on the rule of law and types of law, page 25 through 28. And this will be a shorter lecture than the previous video. To begin, let's define case law. Case law involves stare decisis, which refers to legal precedent, and this means that laws are established based on the outcomes of previous legal cases. Courts are expected to follow the rulings of previous cases, especially if previous cases were decided by higher courts, such as the Supreme Court. Case law therefore encompasses laws that have come from previous judicial decisions made in criminal, civil, and administrative court cases. For this class, we're concerned with case law in criminal cases, although one example I can talk more about in class relates to civil law. I had sued my landlord, and in the judge's decision of the case, she cited previous cases that were relevant to this particular scenario. Thus, the judge used case law to justify her decision. Statutory law, on the other hand, is a more formal body of the legal system that consists of written legislation. For example, you can look up the penal code for the state of New York and see exactly what statutes are violated by specific crimes. Statutory laws generally begin as a bill that is passed through to legislation by federal or state governments. Similarly, although at a lower level of government, codes or ordinances are written laws that are enacted by local entities. So you may be familiar that Fredonia has its own set of ordinances. And one example of an ordinance that Fredonia has relates to requiring that dogs be leashed at all times. And you don't need to memorize this particular ordinance. It is just serving as an example. Moving on to the differences between civil and criminal law. Civil law is a generic term that refers to any non-criminal cases. These non-criminal cases generally proceed to come to a resolution in a dispute between two different parties. And as I mentioned earlier, I have personal experience with a civil case, and I can tell you more about that in class if you'd like. Criminal law, on the other hand, is a term that refers to any cases involving crime. Criminal law defines specific crimes or outlines exactly what behaviors constitute a crime. So criminal law defines specific crimes, so it outlines what behaviors constitute a crime. Additionally, criminal law outlines the punishments for engaging in a crime. So aside from the focus of these laws, civil and criminal law can differ with respect to who files the cases, i.e., as I, the plaintiff, had filed a suit against my landlord, or in criminal cases, a prosecutor or a jury representing the state or federal government may file information or indictment against a defendant. The types of punishment in these laws also vary. So we'll discuss the types of punishments for criminal law later in the semester. And depending on the act, someone can be charged with violating criminal and civil law. One example of an individual whose behavior was addressed in criminal and civil court, is explained more in your text, is O.J. Simpson. One type of criminal law is substantive law, and substantive law is generally outlined in penal codes that explain what behaviors constitute crimes and how said behaviors are punished. And you can sift through the New York State Penal Code and find examples of substantive law, such as this one here. This particular section illustrates an example of substantive law regarding adultery. The Penal Code defines what adultery is and notes that it is a Class B misdemeanor. So in defining what adultery is, it states a person is guilty of adultery when he engages in sexual intercourse with another person at a time when he has a living spouse or the other person has a living spouse. In another section of the Penal Code, it explains the punishments that apply to Class B misdemeanors. So specifically, a Class B misdemeanor, according to New York State Penal Code, is subject to up to a $500 fine. And Class B misdemeanors can also be sentenced to imprisonment up to 3 months with a determinate sentence. Procedural law is another type of criminal law. Procedural law outlines the procedures that the components of the criminal justice system must follow. In many cases, procedural law relates to the actions that law enforcement take in the line of duty. And you may have heard of Miranda warnings, which are applicable to procedural law. Later in the semester, we will cover more details on procedural law and how it relates to such things as evidence being admitted into evidence for court cases. In conclusion, this section outlined a variety of different types of law, including case law, statutory law, codes, ordinances, civil law, criminal law, and types of criminal law, including substantive and procedural law. Pictured here is a comic that has 3 people playing a game, likely Monopoly. The person on the left is dressed in an officer's uniform and is smirking. The person in the middle appears distraught, and the caption reads, "Go directly to jail, do not pass go." But I wasn't read my rights. So what example of law does this illustrate? We can go over the answer in class. And this concludes the lecture for section 3.1.